Okay, thank you. It is in fact related to a new project, but in what way it's related, I wouldn't like to say at this point. But I will talk about the central ideas that are involved with it and see how it takes shape. Now, for the history of science and for the history of philosophy, obviously the word reason and its cognates were clearly ones to be conjured with in the 17th and especially the 18th century. In the latter case, often elevated to a sort of idol. In fact, looking at uses of the term in the 17th century may be a good way of understanding its apotheosis in the 18th through a sort of genealogical tracking that can show us how it happened to acquire its prestige in the so-called Age of Reason. A good starting point for examining 17th century reason is Descartes' 1637 discourse on the method of rightly conducting one's reason and seeking the truth in the sciences. Now, Descartes' use of the word raison in the discourse generally has it meaning something like judgment, whereas in his earlier unpublished rules for the direction of the mind, he tended to use the Latin word ratio in reference to formal inferential reasoning, the mental perception of agreement or disagreement between ideas. So he makes his excuses in the discourse. He says, "My present aim is not to teach the method which everyone must follow in order to direct his reason correctly, but only to reveal how I have tried to direct my own." So Descartes here speaks of his own use of reason as if it were not a capacity, either his method or his reason, that gave him some special standing or credibility. So why should anyone care what this writer, who we should remember was anonymous in the first edition, had to say? Descartes offered at least two arguments for taking what he had to say as valuable. One was the kind of person that he was, and the other was the cash value of his claims about his method, supposedly displayed by the three succeeding essays published with the discourse, the Dioptrics, Geometry, and Meteorology. So, firstly, the way that he accounts for his life thus far makes it clear that he is an honnête homme, a gentleman you can presumably believe. That's why he can afford the self-deprecation. You don't have to follow his example if you don't want to, but see if his way of employing reason doesn't seem just what a decent fellow might do. And then the essays show what he's capable of. Now, part of Descartes' problem here was, of course, to persuade others by flattering their own abilities to agree with him. So he couldn't really say that he was simply cleverer than everyone else, which he might well have wanted to do and probably thought was true. He could get away with this because of the imprecision that attended the use of the term reason then as now. Descartes' own talk of reason never itself served to clarify matters because it was a functional imprecision. A nicely pragmatic and unanalytical definition of reason appears at the beginning of the 18th century by a widely cited French Protestant philosopher and lexicographer, the Cartesian Etienne Chauvin, who says in his Lexicon Philosophicum that according to some leading philosophers, this remember again is the early 18th century, the term ratio cannot be defined. And he goes on, "For what reason is, they say, is sufficiently known to all of us who are distinguished as being rational people. Neither does it matter that reason is on many occasions unknown, obscure, perplexed, for it suffices at least to have, in whatever circumstances, that thorough overview as is called not unknown. Just as the son of a family recognizes his father, even though he will not have recognized him when glimpsed at a distance, or in shadow, or in the bustle of debate, or disguised in the clothes of a pilgrim or a woman." So this particular chauvinist position seems to be that you know reason when you encounter it, even though there might be accidental circumstances when you might fail to recognize it, but there's no in principle difficulty. But Chauvin knows that not all philosophers hold this position. There are also other meanings to the word ratio than the kind whereby you know it when you see it. The great thing about these various senses was that people didn't always make clear which one they were using in any given case. Among these other senses of ratio that have been routinely employed in the 17th century were cause, the capacity for reasoning, mathematical ratio, Aristotelian form, as well as other uses. And this is leaving aside the commonly used term ratiocinatio, ratiocination, to refer to the active use of reasoning. The canonical scholastic discussion of these terms, or things, was due to Thomas Aquinas, derived from Aristotle's De Anima. Aquinas distinguishes between intellect and reason, and the distinction has to do with the presumed process of deductive inference, as Aristotle explained it in his logical writings. Formal deduction rested on fundamental principles or premises, most problematically what Aristotle called axioms. These were primitive statements taken to be true, from which deductive inferences could be drawn. Most famously, the sort that mathematicians used. Like Euclid's and Aristotle's example, the whole is greater than its proper part. Aquinas says that it's the intellect that allows the intuitive perception of the truth of this kind of statement. Without it, you simply couldn't tell that the statement was true. You certainly couldn't demonstrate it from something more simple because it's already a primitive statement. But you had to attribute truthfulness to it, or else whatever you deduced from it would be uncertain. So the idea of the intellect serves here to resolve that difficulty. So that's one intellectual function taken care of. The other component, reason, has a similar job to do. It enables the perception that a new deduced statement follows from prior accepted statements. It's what enables you to say that some conclusion just follows from its established premises. This Aristotelian use of intellect and reason, as passed through the Thomistic pedagogical tradition, gets reiterated all over the place in 16th and 17th century manuals and textbooks. It's no surprise, therefore, that a version of it shows up in Descartes. Rule 7 of his Rules for the Direction of the Mind from the 1620s stresses the mind's intuitive grasp of foundational axiomatic truths, as in mathematics, and then explains how a process of movement through an entire formal deduction should be understood. So he says, I shall run through them, the steps of the deduction, several times in a continuous movement of the imagination, simultaneously intuiting one relation and passing on to the next, until I have learnt to pass from the first to the last so swiftly that memory is left with practically no role to play, and I seem to intuit the whole thing at once. Now, on this view, the human mental ability to reason certainly isn't straightforward and automatic in its operation. As Descartes also stresses in the Discourse in 1637, the movement through the steps of the deduction needs to be disciplined by method, albeit a method sanctioned by thoughtful intuitions. Now, Descartes wasn't original in this view of the matter, as I said. So in 1613, the scholastic lexicon author Rudolf Goclenius had approvingly cited the great 16th century scholar J.C. Scaliger's definition of reason. Reason is nothing other than the motion of the intellect towards a conclusion. And Goclenius himself puts it this way: reason, ratio, is concerned with conclusions rather than with principles. The intellect is what's concerned with principles. So this is a sense of ratio that relates it to the process of reasoning, and the implication is that it's basically about deductive reasoning. At the foundations of the deduction are the starting principles, and at the end of the deduction are the conclusions, exactly like proving a geometrical theorem. But ratio only relates to the conclusions. That's to say, to the deductive process that generates those conclusions. The starting principles, the premises from which the deduction proceeds, are the province of something called the intellect, which is evidently, therefore, something different from reason. By intellect, Goclenius evidently refers to the intellected soul, one of the plethora of souls and their subdivisions that were part of standard interpretation of Aristotle's De Anima. Goclenius says of the intellect that it's about understanding or intellection, whether of itself or of things outside of itself. Much later, at the start of the 18th century, the Cartesian philosopher Chauvin echoes what was evidently still a standard representation. He says, broadly speaking, the intellect as such considers principles, whereas insofar as reason is said to be concerned, then rather with conclusions than with principles. So the idea here is that in a case of formal deductive reasoning, deduction requires premises from which to start. From a statement, or for a statement like a Euclidean axiom, the whole is greater than its proper part, for example, you just have to accept that it's obviously true. You just have to see it. And on Goclenius's as well as Chauvin's account, what perceives its obvious truth is the intellect or understanding. Once the premises or starting principles are then in place, reason can go forward by comparing different ideas to one another so as to generate new statements that lead to deductive conclusions. The intellect operates from the point of view of natural philosophy as a natural feature of the human mind. But reason is something that can be utilized in better or worse ways, as Descartes notices at the start of the discourse. Speaking about what is called good sense or reason, Descartes says that the diversity of our opinions are not due to some being more reasonable than others, but only due to our conducting our thoughts by different ways. From this perspective, reason is a kind of artificial device rather than an innate power of the mind. Or as Hobbes writes in De Corpore, every man brought philosophy, that is natural reason, into the world with him. For all men can reason to some degree and concerning some things, but where there is need of a long series of reasons, there most men wander out of the way and fall into error for want of method, as it were for want of cultivation. And then he elaborates that by talking literally about cultivation of vines and things of that sort. Now these are all rather Aristotelian views that contrast rather starkly with the later characteristically Enlightenment representations of reason as a cognitive faculty, along with memory and imagination. Contrast also what John Locke says in the essay concerning human understanding in 1690. Locke says the word reason in the English language has different significations. Sometimes it's taken for true and clear principles, sometimes for clear and fair deductions from those principles, and sometimes for the cause, and particularly the final cause. But the consideration I shall have of it here is in a signification different from all these, and that is as it stands for a faculty in man, that faculty whereby man is supposed to be distinguished from beasts. Now what Locke says of the English language seems to apply mutatis mutandis for the other European languages as well. For most of the 17th century, not only had reason not counted as one of the mental faculties in philosophical taxonomies, but another one had instead, namely the will. And the will did not demarcate men from beasts, certainly not according to Blaise Pascal. In his Pensées, referring to his mechanical calculator of the 1640s, Pascal observed that the arithmetical machine creates effects that approach thought more nearly than anything animals do, but it does nothing that might make us say that it possesses will as animals do. Here, Pascal's term la pensée seems to mean something similar to ratiocination. Even as late as Chauvin in the early 18th century, the mental faculties are listed, just as they had been by Descartes, as comprising just two in number, namely the intellect or understanding and the will. These were in fact two out of the three that were commonly listed as in Zabarella in the late 16th century following Aristotle, namely intellect, will, and also memory. And as we've seen, the intellect was not the same as reason. Now, faculties were supposed by definition to be active powers, not just potentialities. Before Locke, and even for some avowed non-Aristotelians, like the Cambridge Platonists, for example, reason was more of a logical technique than a power of acting, and certainly not concerned with perceiving forms in the mind of God in some Platonic sense. That's why Descartes tried to teach you a method for using reason. Reason by itself wasn't of much value. Reasoning, ratiocination, was what mattered. What made Descartes himself, for example, worth listening to. Locke was going to clarify this picture formally a few decades later by saying that the faculty of reason, in order to link together ideas that cannot be immediately and self-evidently connected at once, actually performed two offices. It discovered appropriate intermediate ideas, rather like the procedure in rhetoric called inventio, and it then ordered those ideas appropriately so as to construct the chain of inference linking premises to conclusion, perhaps comparable to dispositio in rhetoric. The first of those two offices is closer to what was often called in the fourth and final book of a typical 17th century logic text, method. So the human mental ability to reason, sometimes called reasoning or ratiocination, while it's characteristic of being human, whether from the Cartesian perspective or from the perspective of the scholastic distinction between intellect and reason, isn't straightforward and automatic in its operation. As Descartes said, it needed to be disciplined by method, albeit a method sanctioned by the thoughtful intuitions of reason itself. And notice how Descartes is also keen to minimize the need for memory, the one traditional Aristotelian faculty that he leaves out of the usual list, keeping only intellect and the will. This sense of the reasoning process is the one that we particularly associate with the Enlightenment's notion of reason, I suppose. Although the informal version mentioned by Chauvin that I quoted earlier, whereby reason is so self-evident as not to need detailed exposition, was, no doubt, always preferred in practice. So, reason concerned the techniques overseen by the intellect that go to produce deductive conclusions. Once the premises or starting principles are in place, reason goes forward by comparing different ideas to one another so as to generate new statements. From the point of view of natural philosophy, then, what was known on this specific topic as pneumatology, the intellect operates as a natural property of the human mind, and from this perspective, reason appears as a kind of device, controllable by method, that's to say, controllable by the will, whereas the intellect is an intrinsic property of the mind, the capacity for understanding. Well, I want now to leave aside for the moment scholastic and Cartesian philosophy and see how similar themes are deployed in the work of an experimental and mechanical philosopher, namely Robert Hooke. What Hooke does is to show how these elaborate but apparently rather abstract concepts could be translated, in part at least, into a mechanical idiom. In his 1665 Micrographia, Hooke notes our involuntary wonder, he says, at the strange kind of acting in several animals which seem to savour so much of reason. It's seeming to me most manifest that those are but actings according to their structure. And then he gives an example involving the firing of a gun And he goes on to say, in all which actions there is nothing of intention or ratiocination to be ascribed either to animal or engine, in the case of firing a gun, but all to the ingeniousness of the contriver. Some years later, in a Gresham College lecture that Hooke gives in 1682, he goes into much more detail concerning what he calls a mechanical and sensible figure and picture. As I say, a few years later in 1682, in a Gresham College lecture, Hooke talks about a mechanical and sensible figure and picture of all the actions and operations of the soul. Now, of these operations, Hooke specifies apprehending, remembering, and reasoning. And these three are equivalent, of course, to standard scholastic categories for explicating the soul, namely the intellect, memory, and also reason. The common one that Hooke leaves out, of course, is the will. Now, Hooke's chiefly concerned in this lecture with what he calls the repository or organ of memory, including human awareness of time, which he's particularly interested in discussing in this lecture. His basic approach is to distinguish between an incorporeal soul, physically located at a dimensionless point somewhere inside the brain, and the material brain itself, evidently drawing on the familiarity of Descartes' account of the brain. Hooke stresses that the memory is a sensory organ just as much as the eye or the ear. These are all of them corporeal organs that the soul makes use of, and he says without them cannot effect what it wills. The items stored in this, what Hooke calls repository, are ideas. To some degree, these ideas are implanted by motions conveyed into the brain by the senses, but chiefly, Hooke says, by the soul itself. And then Hooke goes on. This action of the soul is that which is commonly called attention. My notion of it is this, that the soul in the action of attention does really form some material part of the repository into such a shape and gives it some such emotion as is from the senses conveyed thither, which being so formed and qualified is inserted into and enclosed in the common repository, and there for a certain time preserved and retained, and so becomes an organ upon which the soul working finds the ideas of past actions, as if the action were present. This repository, he goes on, I conceive to be seated in the brain, and the substance thereof I conceive to be the material out of which these ideas are formed, so that there is, as it were, a continued chain of ideas coiled up in the repository of the brain. Now, these ideas, which have been emitted over time outwards from a central point in the brain, I will suppose, Hooke says, to be material and bulky. That is, to be certain bodies of determinate bigness and impregnated with determinate motions. And as they have their distinct figures, so have they each of them their distinct qualifications of motions and constitutions. The central point from which these ideas are sent out is the soul, which Hooke had previously described, remember, as an incorporeal being. But this incorporeal soul nonetheless emits a spherical radiation comparable to the light from the sun. So Hooke says the radiation of the soul is more powerful upon ideas at a nearer than at a further distance, and their reaction is also more powerful back again, and that in a duplicate proportion to their distance reciprocal, much the same with that of light, which is the most spiritual action of all we are sensible of in the world. So Hooke describes a sort of resonance between this radiation and the repercussions of the material ideas that it encounters, analogizing it to the sympathetic agreement of musical strings. Now, Hooke's picture of the radiating soul and its interaction with humming ideas in the brain provides his view of what he describes as that action of the soul which is commonly called reasoning. This action, he says, is the forming new ideas from the comparing the reactions from several ideas placed here and there in the repository, and it's being sensible, the soul's being sensible, of the harmony or discord of them one with another. Evidently associating the formal character of this physical process with syllogistic logic, not surprisingly, Hooke asserts that the conclusion that you get is the new idea that's been formed by the comparison of other ideas which may be contained in the major and minor propositions. So in effect, Hooke represents the soul as picking out the conceptual materials that go to produce a deductive inference. In rhetorical terms, the soul carries out the stage of inventio, picking out the appropriate materials for building an argument, and then it's being sensible of the harmony and discord, as he says, of various ideas, serves to produce something new, wherein, Hooke says, all those various respects are in some means united and impressed upon one and the same idea, a coordination that effectively represents what was called in rhetoric dispositio. Characteristically, Hooke's account leaves unclear exactly how much of this process is due to the free action of this incorporeal soul, and how much, on the contrary, is the result of physically determinate interactions between a vibrating soul point in the brain and the equally resonant material and bulky ideas distributed through the brain's repository. But the chief function of the soul, qua incorporeal, seems to be its use of the will to select which of the resonating ideas it will pay attention to and which ones not. The combination or disposition of these ideas by which new ones will be formed results from the soul's awareness of the way in which these ideas, seen as resonators, produce harmony or discord. So the job of the incorporeal soul seems to be the exercise of will as well as its intellectual power of judgment or comparison. And this precisely corresponds, in fact, to the conventional Aristotelian division of the cognitive labor between the will and the intellect, where the intellect, as we know, is about understanding. Inferential reasoning on this model combines these two powers with both the memory, which stands for the preservation of corporeal ideas in the brain's repository, and the process of inventio, whereby the will picks out appropriate ideas for possible subsequent combination. So Hooke's quasi-mechanical model mirrors closely the usual scholastic and Cartesian accounts of the difference between reason and intellect. The former, reason, is concerned with producing conclusions, while the latter concerns the principles or premises from which the conclusions are deduced. For Hooke, the incorporeal soul both selects the premises, using the will, and notices rather than deduces the consequent conclusions, using the intellect. But what's striking is that in this account, the intellect makes these judgments of comparison by its becoming aware of physical harmony or discord located in the brain itself and constituting new ideas. In Hooke's terminology, all these processes together constitute reasoning as the product of a corporeal engine supervised and guided by an immaterial soul. There's no single thing to be identified as a faculty of reason, except perhaps in some phenomenological sense. Nonetheless, the soul, that which steers the boat, still transcends the merely material. Material bodies for Hooke are things that possess shape and motion. That's what matter is good for in his version of mechanical philosophy. By invoking periodic vibration as a particular mode of motion, Hooke makes these inert bodies, with their similarity to the uninformed but reified prime matter of 17th century Aristotelian pedagogy, into interactive resonators that can agree or disagree in their consonances or dissonances. Resonance itself as a phenomenon remains primitive, though. Its familiarity still rests on empirical familiarity with musical strings and bells, rather than on theoretical accounts of the mechanics of simple harmonic motion. Although, of course, we shouldn't entirely forget Hooke's law in this connection. In his 1674 Cutlerian lecture called De Potentia Recitativa, Hooke had played with an idea that links to suggestions made previously by Hobbes and before him Francis Bacon on the behaviour and nature of matter. And the question for Hobbes and Hooke in particular is one that Descartes had also grappled with. The impenetrability of matter. Why do bodies resist penetration by other bodies? What kind of force of resistance is this? Hooke notices that rapid back and forth vibratory motion would itself tend to repel other bodies entering the motion's range of amplitude. And his most striking example, literally and figuratively, imagines a flat iron sheet 1 foot square that moves back and forth extremely rapidly perpendicular to its face across an amplitude of 1 foot. Hooke says, this will compose such an essence as I call in my sense a cubic foot of sensible body. The particles, therefore, that compose all bodies, I do suppose to owe the greatest part of their sensible or potential extension to a vibrative motion. And Hooke goes on to speculate about the particles of all bodies as tending to have some kind of vibrative motion, elaborated in terms of vibrating musical strings and the harmonious motions being communicated between bodies through a subtle fluid of some kind that pervades and surrounds them. His general picture of solid bodies as being made of particles that rattle back and forth against one another is very similar, as I said, to Hobbes's discussions in De Corpore, for example. John Henry has characterized Hooke's use of the similitude of musical harmony in a number of these sorts of instances as an aspect of the spiritual rather than the strictly mechanical in Hooke's physical explanations. Musical vibrations, of course, also involved ratios. So I'd like to return for a moment to some of those other meanings of the term ratio or ratio that were current in the 17th century. Among the senses of ratio that were routinely employed were, as I mentioned before, cause, the capacity for reasoning, mathematical ratio, Aristotelian form, various other senses as well. So I want to look again at Goclenius's philosophical lexicon from 1613. Goclenius, I should mention, was a professor of philosophy at the University of Marburg, and the lexicon is dedicated to the Calvinist Prince Moritz of Hesse-Kassel. Goclenius first gives in his discussion the Greek equivalent of the word ratio, logos, and he notes that it's used in 4 different areas in his particular classification, in logic, philosophy, mathematics, and physics. He then goes on to give discussions of its meaning in each of those distinct areas. Now, the philosophical meaning is the most general one that he provides. Ratio can mean, properly speaking, reason as that which can be said of men, in other words, a capacity for reasoning, but more commonly it's used also to refer to its particular applications, where it compares and relates things, which apparently, according to Goclenius, even some animals can do. In this sense, it's concerned with analogies of various kinds. And as Goclenius explains, this is where the specifically mathematical sense of the word comes from. A ratio is an analogy or proportionality between things. But in logic and metaphysics, things get a bit more complicated. And as befits a Calvinist professor, Goclenius provides a Ramist diagram of appropriate subdivisions of the principal sense in that disciplinary context, which is ratio as a formal or else an objective concept. in effect, in the latter case, a definition. It's worth mentioning, by the way, that the trace of Ramism in the exposition doesn't indicate a particularly doctrinaire confessional line on such questions. Gaclenius frequently quotes the usual sorts of authorities, from Aquinas to Scaliger and especially Zabarella, although he doesn't seem to cite Jesuits. The point is that he's expositing a cosmopolitan, albeit Christian, philosophical disciplinary universe rather than a narrowly confessional one. I might mention, by the way, though it's not directly to the points I want to make, that Chauvin was also a Calvinist. And Gaclenius's Ratio Formalis, one of his subdivisions, also appears in Chauvin's lexicon of the early 18th century as a metaphysical sense of ratio, meaning that which makes something what it is. Chauvin also explains how the meaning in logic could be subdivided, as it routinely had been throughout the 17th century and long before, into the many kinds of possible answers to why questions. But Chauvin provides a compendious account of ratio in logic that raises it above a mere technical systematization. He concludes like this. He says, "Indeed, reason properly illuminates propositions, just as light itself brightens and darkens in turn." Now, this is a metaphor of reason as illumination that appears often in Descartes as much as in Thomas Aquinas and many others. Giving examples and definitions for some statement, according to Chauvin, is not properly to illuminate it, but at least an occasion to provide that it be illuminated. Although it's worth noting that, unlike most earlier commentators on this matter, Chauvin does not specifically associate the illumination here with the illumination of God. Malebranche, by contrast, had just a couple of decades earlier not only associated ratio with specifically divine illumination, but he'd also made a direct link with ratio's Greek equivalent, logos, in the specifically Christian theological sense of Christ as the Word in St. John's Gospel, the second person of the Trinity. That was, one might say, a theological context for ratio, and by no means a usual one, but it was built directly on the disciplinary meanings found in logic rather than specifically in metaphysics. So in a generic 17th century Christian context, ratio, reason, or reasoning, ratiocination, were usually in one way or another associated with the transcendent, whether explicitly divine or not. In metaphysics, it had to do with grasping inner natures or essences. In logic, it invoked some kind of metaphorical light to justify its inferences from one statement to another. Now, closely connected to those images, we also have the common term right reason. This is a classical expression that apparently originates in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, orthos logos. Cicero adopted the Stoic version of the term into Latin as ratio recta. Orthos logos is also found in the Greek of the New Testament. Its use in the 17th century seems often to have been fairly loose, to mean things like sound reason or common sense or sound practical reasoning, ethically sound reasoning, things like that. Reason that's approvable in some way. In both Catholic and Protestant Europe, right reason was also often a form of reason that was correctly aligned with orthodox interpretations of Christian revelation. Lottie Mulligan has studied this religious connotation of the term in England in the 17th century, particularly in connection with Robert Boyle, where right reason always supported and never contradicted orthodox religious teaching. In effect, right reason was often regarded as a form of reason that hadn't been corrupted by the fall, or else that had been restored with the help of God's grace and the sweat of man's brow, a theme that Peter Harrison has written on to some consequence in recent years. Boyle actually makes a distinction between right reason and hypothetical reason, where hypothetical reason rests on explicitly hypothetical principles. Boyle acknowledges that the term reason itself isn't usually very clear when people talk about whether some belief conforms to reason or not. He insists that he means conforming to right reason, which in practice doesn't turn out to be much clearer itself. Chauvin is actually quite straightforward on the point in his lexicon, saying that ratio recta is opposed to ratio depravata, depraved reason, and either refers to the sort of reasoning that a properly functioning mind engages in, or in the case of ethics, when it produces salutary conclusions. So whether you were Boyle or Chauvin or anyone else, the successful representation of your claims as conforming to right reason was a valuable achievement. And being able to do it meant that you were yourself reasonable. Now, it's well known that in the 18th century, a conventional stand-in to authorize the predilections of the philosophe, for example, was the notional reasonable man. This fictional character had sometimes to be invoked precisely because defining reason as an operational concept was so difficult. D'Alembert says in the preliminary discourse to the Encyclopédie in 1751, quote, "The art of reasoning is a gift which nature bestows of her own accord upon men of intelligence, and it can be said that the books which treat this subject," he's referring here to logic textbooks, "are hardly useful except to those who can get along without them." That's a view of reasoning as something that's inadequately formalized by syllogistic logic, and that seems to be something akin to good manners, or perhaps like being in a state of grace. Some people just know how to get it right. And as D'Alembert also said, like Locke before him, reason has also become a faculty of the mind. It's as if the specifically logical usage of the term has become a mental power, a faculty, that's shaken off all but the most technical alternative senses. As such, it no longer relied on the natures of external things or on God to underwrite that power. Reason had somehow become self-sufficient or self-enlightening. And as Descartes had already noticed long before, some people were better at using it, whatever it was, than others. Okay, thank you.